kind enough to join us, traveling all over the place from Iowa to South Carolina. The New York Times has got her going everywhere, Nick. She's a fantastic politics reporter over there. Maya King joins us. Maya, Mike, and Nick, thanks for hopping on the pod again.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be back.
You know, Maya, in all seriousness, you have been traveling everywhere. You've been talking to Republican voters, Democratic voters. I want to get into a bunch of it with you and some of your stops, what you're hearing from voters and some of their issues. Who are they focused on candidate wise? But let's start first with the most recent thing, which we were talking about a little bit in our first segment. We teased you, which is the South Carolina primary. I mean, it flew under the radar. For people that don't know, the Democratic primary was this past Saturday, depending upon when you're watching or listening to this. President Biden won overwhelmingly. What do we make of it? What did you make of it as you were covering it on the ground?
Yes, you're right. It was a very sleepy primary. The first thing we were all looking at was turnout. So the Biden campaign had made very clear that South Carolina was going to be the real first officially recognized primary. For context, South Carolina was moved to the front of the line. Democrats voted to, or really spearheaded by President Biden, to put South Carolina first in the nation for the first time and give Black voters specifically a larger platform in deciding who they want to be the president of the United States. But as we also know, this was a very uncompetitive primary. Biden was running against Dean Phillips of Minnesota, who was really introducing himself to the rest of the country for the first time in South Carolina for the last 2 weeks, and Marianne Williamson, the author, self-help expert who has run for president before, but again, just really didn't register. So it was kind of a given going into the primary that Biden was going to win and was going to win overwhelmingly. And so the questions that we were asking leading up to primary night were, what is a target number of people that you would like to see turn out, that Democrats would like to see turn out, that would show some real momentum and real enthusiasm for Biden on the ground? And few Democrats were really willing to weigh in there and give us sort of a ballpark number. Right now, checking the South Carolina Elections Commission site, I think turnout rounded out at around 150, which is, for a presidential primary year, not very high, but for an largely uncontested presidential primary, not awful either. And a majority of those voters, of those Democratic voters, were Black voters. I don't know at this point, how much more we can say in terms of, extrapolating Black enthusiasm or saying anything really definitive about how Black voters writ large feel about Biden based solely off of the South Carolina results. But I do think the message that Democrats paraded really throughout South Carolina for the last few weeks will be on display in other predominantly Black cities throughout this presidential campaign now as it kicks into general election mode.
Recently, you'd also had posted something about in terms of Black members of the church, Black preachers that had talked about their misgivings with the Biden administration, particularly as it related to the request for a ceasefire, the push for a ceasefire within the church that the Biden administration has not responded to. Considering the turnout you saw, what you're speaking to in terms of, the Black voter enthusiasm, at least just measured against South Carolina, what's your read currently of where the president's sitting with voters?
So, are we talking about Black voters specifically? Or?
Oh, sorry, yeah, I meant Black voters.
We did some polling at the Times late last year that showed some real dips in enthusiasm among Black voters. And I think that it might have ticked up just a bit, particularly as Black voters who might have considered staying home or starting to see some of the rhetoric coming from former President Trump and other Republicans that has heavy leans into race and xenophobia. A number of Black voters who were a little bit reticent about voting for Biden again are saying, well, I'm considering the alternative. But as it relates to the calls for a ceasefire in the war between Israel and Hamas, there is this really interesting trend that I'm observing, which is a lot of Black voters, maybe otherwise moderate Democrats, now looking at with images of death and destruction in Gaza, and seeing the role that America has played, that Biden has played in helping fund Israel's war against Hamas. They condemn, of course, the attacks on October 7th. But again, looking at what's happening in Gaza, kind of really just dismayed and really disappointed, I think, in President Biden. And so that could be a problem for him heading into November, depending on what happens or continues to happen really in the Middle East right now.
Yeah, it's a good point because there's looks like there's no end in sight. We don't even know about the hostages and when they're going to be coming back. There's negotiations on that front. I did want to pivot real quick. Let's pivot to the other party, the other political party in this country. And we're going to get to the third party candidates too, because I know you've been talking a little bit about those folks as well. But you were in Iowa. I mentioned it before as I was kidding, as you've been making the circuits of all these different states and racking up the Delta Airlines miles, maybe. I don't know if Delta flies to Iowa. But
Delta and Marriott.
Okay, all right, perfect. And Marriott points, right. So tell me a little bit about the Iowa caucus was, it feels like forever ago. And obviously the networks were calling it, within 20 minutes of the doors closing for President Trump. As you were on the ground there in Iowa and you're talking to voters and stuff like that, what was some of the sense that you were getting? Obviously, things have changed now because Ron DeSantis is no longer in the race. Nikki Haley, it's a two-person race for all intent and purpose. But what were some of the things that you were hearing from voters there on the ground in Iowa about the former president? Would they vote for him in the general? What were some things that were shaking out there as you were talking to Republican voters?
Yeah, the Republican Party right now, I would say, is pretty fragmented. So there is a strong kind of unwavering base of voters in the GOP who are all in for President Trump, who see the indictments and the charges against him as political persecution, who believe him when he says, I'm fighting for you, and look at what they're doing to me. So imagine what they'll do when they get to you, who see him as a firewall against partisan government persecution. But there are also a lot of Republican voters who do not want to see Trump run again, who disagree with not only his rhetoric, but his criminal record now that's been established, and feel like, in a general election, he won't win. And I think at the end of the day, that is really what is motivating all Republicans right now, is winning. And it's winning the presidency and defeating Democrats, owning the libs, as it were. And they're also, so when I was in Iowa, I spent caucus night in Grinnell, which is a college town about 40 miles away from Des Moines. And the college students were actually out of town, so I didn't get a good sense of the college, young Republican vote. But there were a lot of older folks there. And caucuses are really almost like neighborhood commission meetings. Everyone knows everyone. You're split into different groups according to your neighborhood. So it's like a very close knit community in each caucus, and people know each other, and they may not necessarily know how each other votes, but they recognize each other. And at this particular site, if I remember correctly, Trump won, but not by very much. Ron DeSantis was a very close second, and Nikki Haley wasn't far behind him either. And I spoke to a number of people who were just saying, I don't want Trump to run again. I really don't. I would vote for anybody but him. And then I, of course, follow up and say, well, what happens if he does win the party's nomination? Would you vote for him in a general election? And most folks I talked to said, yeah, I'll hold my nose and vote for Trump. Again, because they want their person to win. And because they really, really sense a very strong animus towards President Biden from Republicans too.
Quick break from our pod to tell you about a new pod at Fresh Roasted Coffee, Envy Pods. So if you go to freshroastedcoffee.com, my partner's shaking his head. That's a good transition. Are you crazy?
It was good. No, I shook my head. I was like, that's brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you.
Because I saw this picture earlier. I was like, I saw what you're doing.
It is pretty good. That's right. So listen, the new Envy Pods over at freshroastedcoffee.com, the official sponsor of Can We Please Talk, environmentally safe, compostable. You can go check these out at freshroastedcoffee.com. When you open up the package, it smells delicious. I'm telling you, you can't smell it on here, but I promise you that when I opened this morning to make my cup of coffee, it was delicious. Head to freshroastedcoffee.com today. Use the promo code CanWeGet20 for 20% off your first order or hit the link in our show details.
We've seen polling that talks about that Trump's numbers can be favorable in terms of an economic turnaround. That said, though, recent jobs report, we're looking at over 300,000 jobs added, which is far exceeding a lot of expectations. What is it about Democrats or their messaging, particularly, that's not resonating with voters and giving the sense that possibly that Trump seems to be a better candidate? I can't help but laugh because this person's economically reckless, but that is what it is. But what is not sinking into the voters' heads, for lack of a better phrase, that the economy continues to do better. The Biden administration seems to be on an uptick. And I'm measuring this against the jobs report, even against the stock market. But that doesn't seem to be sort of poking into the narrative that voters are down on the president with the current state of affairs in terms of the economy.
Yeah, my colleagues a couple weeks ago wrote this story about the vibe session, and I thought that was just the perfect way to describe kind of how a lot of voters are feeling right now is that yes, the economy might be doing better, is doing better by nearly all metrics, but people don't really feel it. And I think it's just sunk in that people don't really feel it. Groceries are still pretty expensive. Gas is still pretty expensive. There's still a general sense of malaise out there. But I will say the Biden campaign, to its credit, is now getting out ahead of that feeling. Well, I won't say getting out ahead of it, but is acknowledging that that feeling is out there, and is really trying to underline, all of these other metrics that show the economy is actually pretty healthy. And the one thing that Democrats and allies of Biden are repeating over and over right now is that here we are in February. We have about 9 months until the presidential election. A lot can change, and people's feelings can change too. So if the economy continues at its current pace, there is a very, very real chance that that starts to think into the minds of voters. Oh, this is actually, I do have a job, and prices are starting to come down, and I don't know if they'll go so far as to say, this is a thank you Biden moment, but perhaps.
I always love when people say, oh, damn you, Trump, or damn you, Biden, when they look at gas prices and stuff like that. It always makes me laugh about voters. This is why we have you on, Maya. So let's talk about two groups of voters that you and I happen to be a part of, Blacks and Latinos. Okay, let's talk about these groups because I saw a recent Roper Center poll that said Biden now is claiming about 63% of Black voters nationwide. And it's down from like 87%, and he trails by 5 percentage points according to the Hispanic voters that have been surveyed for some of this stuff. So it's very intriguing because right now everybody's over analyzing things. It's so early. There's not that much to talk about. We're kind of in this February swoon where, there's only 3 primaries. One's already probably done in Nevada coming up with how that's split up. So there's not much to talk about, and everybody's looking towards this general election. As we move towards November, what does President Biden or even President Trump, what do each of them have to do to both of these groups of voters to say that they're the candidate for them? What is it that you're hearing from voters, people in your family? I'm hearing it from people in my family, trust me, and we've talked about it ad nauseum on this show, some of it nonsensical. But like, what is it that you feel that both of these gentlemen need to do, or even Nikki Haley, if she's able to somehow win one of these primaries? What are they saying to Blacks and Latinos to get them to vote for them in November?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think we have to do a number of things. I'll start there. Biden and Democrats used South Carolina as a real proving ground for in terms of their message to Black voters. So Biden was in South Carolina. He visited twice. Vice President Harris, visited 3 times. The First Lady was there a few times. Second gentleman came too. Of course, DNC Chair Jamie Harrison is from South Carolina, so he just went home and never really left. And all of these big name national Democrats were on the ground in South Carolina for over a month, nonstop, talking about policies that directly related to Black voters, directly challenging a lot of the top line issues that Black voters have mentioned, things like student loan debt, delivery on voting rights legislation, delivery on just affordability in the economy, a number of metrics like Black unemployment being at record lows, funding for HBCUs. Like they just went through this heavily Black state and really pushed this message And like I said at the top of the show, I think we can expect to see that repeat itself in many other states. Now, I think Trump's argument, honestly, right now, he doesn't really seem to have much of an argument or a message for Black or Latino or Asian, any real voters of color. Um, he has surrogates who seem to be very confident in his um, prospects with voters of color. People like Tim Scott, a Black Republican from South Carolina, who has been very vocally supportive of the former president, and who I think has marketed himself as a potential top surrogate, possibly a vice presidential candidate who could appeal to Black men. Because one thing, and I wonder if you've seen this, is um, the gender gap, that really exists across race, but is pretty pronounced, I think, among Black and Latino voters, where, men in particular are really more interested in supporting Republicans. So that's one thing that I think will be interesting to watch is if Black men indeed do show some real proclivities towards voting for Trump. I think their argument is more economic, but we could have a whole episode all about this, the Black and Latino vote. And I'll say one more thing, sorry, just one thing, which is that, we have to kind of say at the top, right? Black and Latino voters are not monolithic. Neither group is monolithic. And there's so much diversity within the Latino community. There is not one single Latino community. There are multiple, from different countries and just totally different experiences. Black Americans, I think, are we also have a lot of different backgrounds and come from a lot of different places. Yes, that informs our voting behavior, but repeatedly, we have voted for Democrats upwards of 80 to 90%. And I've talked to other experts in my reporting and just folks who really study, and pollsters who study Black voting behavior, who have said, well, Black Americans are also united in one sort of universal experience, which is how Black folks actually arrived in this country, and of course how they were treated, which makes their vote for Democrats feel a lot more like a survival vote, which is why I think you see such big groups of Black voters going for Democrats. But that's also why it's so interesting that we're starting to see some fragmentation there too. Sorry, I feel like that was a lot, but I wanted to make
No,
sure
I think it's a great answer, and and I'll be the first to say it. Men can be trash. There, it is. We titled the episode that way. On the subject, well, there's no segue to that. I don't want to dump on the third parties like this, but with
Speaking
third,
of,
yeah. But you were talking about, you mentioned some of the third party candidates, or at least, well, the Democrats. Obviously, these are people within the party, but when we look at, the folks like Jill Stein, now Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been listed as an independent, I've seen now. So this doesn't seem to be a Ralph Nader 2000 thing. Like, it doesn't seem like there is no third party candidate who's really galvanizing people. Cornel West, another person I don't want to leave off the list. But what's been your sense of, because you mentioned the enthusiasm in South Carolina, and obviously, this is the president now. This is not a candidate. But with regards to like third party energy, because there definitely is a sense of voter apathy. I think every measure we've seen points to that. But what's your feeling about the third party? Like, what sense are you getting that people potentially may explore any other option, or yeah, like it kind of falls flat when you talk about third parties, at least in this race. But what's been your sense of that?
I really leave it to the reporting of others on this because it is very interesting, but we just really don't know what will happen there. There was a lot of freak out from Democrats in particular over the no labels possibility that someone like Joe Manchin or Larry Hogan or another like kind of another Republican or in Manchin's case Democrat, a figure that has a lot of broad appeal with both parties might actually really hurt Biden. But honestly, I think the universal takeaway from this third party fervor and just the kind of attention that we're paying to it is it's another reflection of how much this is an election. This is a rematch that nobody really wants. Democrat or Republican, a majority of voters really didn't want to see Biden and Trump run against each other again. and watch the spectacle of like two old white guys yell at each other over a lot of the same things when there are real crises at work. And I think that the third party appeal is for folks who say, you know, neither one, and that could be a lot of people, and we don't really know who that hurts more right now.
That's a great point there, Maya. Before we let you go, you know, you do such great work. And I was mentioning before your travel mileage, but also if you go to the New York Times website to just look up Maya King, you're going to see like 11 articles, like in a matter of 48 hours. So you've been writing your, you know what, off. And so I want to ask you before we let you go, obviously everybody's North Star is kind of, you know, the election in 2024, but what are some things that you're focused on right now covering? As I mentioned, is kind of, we're in a little bit of like a dead period right now in February with respect to the primaries, but what are some things that are on your horizon as we get to Super Tuesday and later on into the primaries and the RNC? What are some things that you're covering over at the Times?
Well, I'm really interested in stories. I continue to be interested in stories about voters and the coalitions that Democrats and Republicans are building. So I hope to have more stories for you about really how Black voters are feeling, how young voters are feeling also. I live in Atlanta, and it is a sprawling, you know, suburban metropolis now. The Atlanta suburbs is kind of its own universe outside of the city of Atlanta. And so I'm hoping to really spend a lot of time in those suburbs and redefine what it means and what we think of when we say, you know, suburban women or suburban men. Because I think that's a lot of different backgrounds and statuses. So I'm excited about that. And then outside of the presidential race, I'll have my eyes on the North Carolina governor's race. It's looking like it's going to be an interesting one. I think Democrats will invest there. So that's what I got for now. We'll see. I think anything could happen though. I could say all that and then
Right. Anything can happen. That may be the title of the episode. That may be the actual title of the episode, Nick. Maya does a great job. Please follow her on social media. Check out all of her work over at the NewYorkTimes.com. She's a fantastic politics reporter. Maya, thanks for giving us a couple minutes. Continued success. Stay safe. All the traveling, please be safe.
I will. Thank you for having me again. It was great to be back on.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it. And we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.